Leah Courtney. I'm a homeschooling mom and a business owner at As We Walk Along the Road. And I have a passion for using great literature with your kids. So this video is part of my literature-based learning series. And today I want to specifically address the question, what is literature-based learning? When you hear that word, it's kind of a buzzword in some homeschooling circles. And so you might have heard it and be wondering, what are people really referring to when they talk about literature-based learning? So the best way that I can sort of show you what this is to describe literature-based learning and what it looked like in my homeschool, especially when my kids were younger. I currently have kids who are aged 15 to 22. So the oldest two have graduated from homeschooling, and my oldest two only have their senior year left. So things look a little bit different now than they did as my kids were growing up and going through school. But here's an example of what day-to-day literature-based learning looked like in our homeschool. One time with my younger girls, when they were probably upper elementary aged, we read the book Poppy by Avi. Now, Poppy is the story of a little brown mouse and how she has to brave the journey going across the big owl's land and not getting caught by this big owl. And she has to make it across and find a place where her family can spread out and have more room and more food. Because where they live right now, all of the food has pretty much been eaten, and these little mice are going to starve if they don't have a bigger place to live and more access to food. So little Poppy is going to save the day, but she has to brave this great owl that watches over these mice. So we were reading the book Poppy, and as we read the book Poppy, we did several activities to learn different things. We studied the life of little brown mice, field mice. How do they live? Where do they live? What are they like? What do they eat? We also studied owls. Where do they live? Where can you find different types of owls? We dissected an owl pellet, which was lots of fun. One of my girls was really grossed out by it, but I found it very interesting. So we dissected this owl pellet. We did things like make a craft of a little mouse using what else? Paper plates, the classic kids' craft material. But we did lots of these activities that all focused around this book that we were reading, Poppy. So that's what literature-based learning can look like. Literature-based learning is just building your learning around a great book or books. Sometimes when people talk about literature-based learning, they talk about Charlotte Mason. Charlotte Mason was a British educator who lived in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and she had been orphaned at a young age. And as she grew up, she wanted to reform the educational system in Britain, and she wanted to give kids access to good education. And so she developed several principles and methods of education. She wrote books about them. She started a school where these principles and methods were used. And she has lots to say about learning with great books. So often you will hear her name mentioned when you hear about literature-based learning. Now, I would not say that I am exactly a Charlotte Mason homeschooler. I do use some Charlotte Mason methods. I definitely use great books and try to build what we're learning around those great books. But you can be a literature-based homeschooler without necessarily using all of Charlotte Mason's methods and ideas. So here's a contrast between literature-based learning and a structured textbook style of learning. Let's go back to the book Poppy that we were talking about. With that book, we were learning about a number of different things. We were learning about mice, we were learning about owls, we were learning about the environment that they were living in, like fields, woods, habitats, what was the difference. We were learning lots of different things about those topics. So all of those things were pretty much science related. We could have, instead of reading the book Poppy, which was a very engaging fiction book, and doing these activities that helped us dig deeper into some of these topics, instead of that, we could have just been reading a science book. I could have a 3rd or 4th grade level science book, and we read a chapter about habitats, we read a chapter about mice or small mammals, we read a chapter about birds. So that kind of is a contrast. Now think about, what would you prefer doing? What do you think would engage your kids the most? To be reading a very interesting fiction book and then tie in these science-based lessons with different activities and hands-on projects, or just reading some chapters out of this science book about mammals, habitats, birds? Which would be more interesting and more engaging? I think that literature-based learning is much more interesting and engaging. I think that the good stories that we use can hold the kids' attention, it can hold my attention better, and I think it can help them to make connections that they might not make if they're just listening to a textbook that's boring, that they just kind of tune out. So that's the difference between literature-based learning and something like more traditional textbook style learning. There are a few main elements of literature-based learning. The first is that they use real living books. Now there's another video in this series that's talking all about living books. What are they and where can you find them? But literature-based learning really focuses on using these real living books, books that are going to capture the attention of the reader or the listener, and books that they're going to want to come back to again and again. These can be fictional or they can be nonfiction. Nonfiction books can be real living books as well. So your curriculum is going to be centered on real living books. Also in literature-based learning, the books that you're using are usually around a theme. So history themes are some of my favorites. Let's say that we're studying the Middle Ages. Then we're going to read some historical fiction that's set in the Middle Ages. We might read a nonfiction book about castles and knights. And all of these books are going to be centered around this main theme of the Middle Ages. So that's another component of literature-based learning. Then you are going to have some activities to accompany the books that you're reading. One of the videos in this series specifically talks about 4 different activities that you can use with great books that you're reading, but there are lots of others as well. So you might have some hands-on activities. You might have kids doing a project that reflects what they are learning. But literature-based learning is going to have activities that go along with these real living books that you're reading. And literature-based learning can involve kids reading independently or you reading aloud to the kids. Now, my preference is always to read aloud. I love reading aloud with my kids, even with older high school aged kids. I just love reading aloud. And there's so many benefits of reading aloud with your family. There is another video in this series that's all about the benefits to the whole family for reading aloud. And so I love to read books aloud when I use literature-based learning. But you can also have kids be reading independently in your literature-based learning as well. And we have also had some of that as my kids get up into the high school years. because some of them have used different curricula as they got older. It's still all literature based, but it's from different curricula companies, different books that they're reading. So they're reading it independently. So literature-based learning can involve kids reading independently or you reading aloud. Literature-based learning is a really great way for kids to actually be interested in the material and to make connections. I can remember when we first started out homeschooling, I used a very traditional textbook workbook style approach. I had been a classroom teacher before I had kids, and I chose to use the same materials pretty much that I was using in the classroom. And I can specifically remember when my oldest daughter was probably first grade, and we had been using these materials through her kindergarten years and then into first grade. And I can remember distinctly sitting with her and we were reading out of a history textbook that went with her curriculum. And we were reading, and she was a very avid reader. She had read early. So we were taking turns going back and forth. I would read a part, she would read a part. And it just struck me how boring what we were reading was. It really was boring. My daughter was one who jumped into pretty much anything school related. She loved learning. And so she wasn't really complaining about it, but I could tell it was boring to her too. And it was really boring to me. And I thought at that moment, there has to be something different. I had always been an avid reader. I love books. I had always been reading aloud to my kids. I just didn't consider that part of our homeschool. But it struck me in this moment as we were reading through this textbook that there had to be something better. There had to be a better way to do this. And we found that way when we switched to literature-based learning. So if you are beginning to get frustrated with a traditional textbook workbook curriculum, if you're just getting started in homeschooling and you're exploring your options for how to go about this whole homeschooling thing, I hope that you will consider literature-based learning. It can be a great way to learn, and it can be a great way for kids to really make connections with the topics that they're reading about.